That's fine. Perfect.
All right, I think we're getting ready here. Let's see how it loads. And I got to make sure I press play again. And I'll go back to the Zoom. Okay. All right, John, we are here live on Facebook, and we've entitled this Histamine and Stress and Genetics, Oh My. And kind of a play on Wizard of Oz. Is that what it is? So anyways, what I wanted to do today was talk to you guys. We had just started talking about histamine and the stress response and how different things like foods and environmental triggers and alcohol and infections and stressors can bring about a histamine response. And if you're not aware of those things, that's one level. But when there's the genetic component involved, you have to be aware of that going into it, because it's the blueprint of all the other stuff that you need to be aware of. And that's what we're going to be teaching you guys. So John's here today to get the party started. So John, thanks for being here again today.
No problem. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah. So again, so as far as, so I guess how do you want to get started with this? I know you got a couple of presentations, or not even presentations, but just a couple of studies that you've done where you lead up in terms of the testing. So how do you want to go about doing this?
So I guess when we kind of chatted about doing a follow-up on this from what we talked about, I think was it maybe last week or week before, about histamine and gut histamine components, things of that nature. Literally within a couple of days after that, I probably had a dozen or more people reach out, via either literally call my office or emailing or private messaging me on Facebook. And a lot of people kind of maybe got a pretty good idea of, okay, there's these genes that deal with histamine metabolism, primarily histamine issues in the gut that can lead to GI issues, fatigue, hormone imbalance, whatever it may be, because histamine is such a huge disruptor. And we kind of talked about, okay, these are things you can do about going on a low histamine diet. You can supplement diamine oxidase enzymes. But I did have multiple people actually, reach out and say, are there any tests that they can do? And a bunch of people say, can they just have a histamine marker ran in their blood work, and kind of how do you test that aspect to figure out, okay, yes, I have those genetic components, but is it something that's a player? Is it clinically relevant, how we would term it, based on genetics? Because genetics isn't the be all end all, and that's what we got to understand. Genetics is that roadmap in terms of, what rocks are turned under, what rabbit holes we got to go down. And then we can really correlate it through based on symptoms someone's experiencing, positive lab markers, or actually through some kind of trial run on certain nutrient aspects. And we're talking about the gut histamine. There actually are ways to test it to figure out, okay, if you have one genetic copy or you have no genetic copies, or even like I discussed last week, if you have one mutation, two mutation, or no mutations, like I have no genetic mutations in my ABP1 genes, but I still supplement with diamine oxidase enzymes because I tend to eat a higher histamine diet, more Mediterranean, and kind of pushing the ketogenic from time to time. But even when I'm not doing that, it seems like every meal that I eat, there's something that's higher in histamine. And so I just feel better taking the DAO enzymes versus when I don't take them. So what I wanted to do was basically just pretty much go through a case study of kind of what we see in clinical practice and kind of how this genetic component correlates in terms of, hey, this is the genetic piece. Now, these are things from a laboratory standpoint that really drive that home. And these are some of the symptomatic changes that people can experience, in a short period of time when you find some of these kind of needles in the haystacks when you look at genetics a little bit deeper besides just MTHFR.
Well, you know what? It's an awesome thing that you just touched upon, John, because I guess it's kind of like, on the one hand, you can say the genetics aren't the end all be all, which is 100% accurate. But on the other hand, it's almost like, because I know the genetics, I could say the genetics aren't the end all be all, because I know going into looking at the genetics exactly what need to be looked at based on what I see on the genetics, right? So, if I see that there's some susceptibilities in this area or that area, it's not the end all be all, but you always ask me, well, what's she dealing with, right? What's her symptoms? And right. So unless you know what her symptoms are, doesn't matter what the genetics are. But So on the one hand, we're saying, hey, the genetics aren't the end all be all, because we really want to know what's going on with your life and what's your main, what are you presenting with? But on the other hand, with the genetic component, I know that once we understand and open that up, and then I ask you the questions, I could reverse engineer what's going on with your genetics and then start to put in place the things that need to get put into place with. And that's what the MTHFR, crash course really is. If we can kind of rewind that soundbite and come up with a really better, name for it, because that's in effect what the MTHFR crash course is. So what John is saying right now is, based on that premise, he wants to show you these tests that he's done that really puts all the pieces together. So show us that, John, exactly what you came up with.
And that's, great. And you kind of even talk about when we talk about genetics as the highway, genetics that isn't the be all end all, but it kind of tells you where to look. It's almost like we talk about the analogy of, our genetics is the highway and the stressors of the traffic on the highway. Well, when you look at genetic reports, it's like the map. It's like the road map to kind of say, okay, what are we dealing with and where do we start looking and turning those rocks over. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and share my screen. And then we can look at some of these slides and kind of review a case study here. So I'll make it here. There we go. Okay. So I hope everybody can see that. You see that all right, Joel?
Yeah, see it really well.
Okay, perfect. So basically this is just a case review. This is a patient of mine who really this whole histamine and DAO component really was a big player for her. It was a big home run. It was a big missing piece of the puzzle. Now, we talk about some of these deal breakers. We've been talking about histamine a lot. And the thing is this always is a problem for everybody. The thing is it is a problem for a handful of people. Maybe 50, 60% of people have issues with histamine, maybe more than that. But the thing is, a lot of times it's a rock that's never turned over. It's a rabbit hole people aren't going down. And when it is a significant player, it can be very life-changing when you get a hold of this. So this is a patient, Brenda, and Brenda initially reached out to me before the holidays. And, she's seen multiple functional medicine doctors. And we decided, she came with a whole thick kind of binder of all these lab tests, all stool tests, SIBO tests, adrenal profiles, blood work, you name it, she was tested for it. Which is pretty typical what I see. And the only thing that was really checked on her was MTHFR. And so that's why she came to me, because she had a compound heterozygous MTHFR mutation. She found out that, I'm one of the persons in the Atlanta area that kind of specialized in that. She came into my office. And so my first thing is, hey, that binder's all important, but based on your history and based on these labs, we got to look at full genetic profile. So we went ahead and did a full genetic test on her. And we didn't get
Did she have, sorry to interrupt, did she have like plus, what was she, homozygous or heterozygous?
She was compound heterozygous. So she had a copy of the 677 and one copy of the 1298. Okay. So maybe about a 40-50% reduction in how her MTHFR could function. And she was taking methylfolate and, it maybe made a difference some days, other days it didn't, kind of that same scenario. So we did full genetic testing on her and we got the test back pretty much like the results came back over Christmas. Okay. So I think initially probably saw her like in November. We got the results back right around Christmas time. So I saw her the first week of January. Okay. And we went through genetics and just based on her symptoms, I went ahead and kind of pulled a couple other labs that typically aren't ran. But in her case, she did do an organic acids test and her histidine levels were really elevated. So because her histidine levels are elevated, histidine is a precursor to histamine. I wanted to go ahead and say, all right, let's save some time and let's just run some of the tests that I look at that can assess histamine and DAO, because if there's genetic factors with that and an abnormal lab from that standpoint, now we may have something to work with. So this is kind of a laundry list.
Sorry, it's awesome stuff. So basically, that a lot of people have done the organic acid test. And I always, for those that are kind of new and they're watching this, the way I kind of explain it to them, John, is just like, hey, think of the organic acid test like just like you're a fire pit inspector and you just had a burning log and you want to go and examine that log to see what kind of log it was and if there's impurities on it and so forth and so on. And so anyways, the reason I bring that up is because you saw on an organic acid test protein markers that showed there was a histamine concern. And so from there, you already had genetic information. And so you just needed a couple more investigative clues like a detective does, and say, okay, I'm going to order this test over here. And so take us through those tests, which you did.
And I'm going to show you exactly the tests that we ran that can confirm that aspect. So, going through it, usually at that point, maybe I would just start with genetics, but based on some things in the previous labs, I said, let's go in and order some testing that maybe investigates this histamine aspect a little bit more, because there could be some mast cell activation components with it. And I really thought that this was kind of more of a mast cell based issue from the start. But, she had kind of the laundry list of symptoms of basically a lot of the people that I consult with, from an adult standpoint. She had IBS symptoms. She was having bowel movements, 2 to 3 times a week. So like every third day at best. She, was diagnosed with SIBO, leaky gut issues. She tried various diet, things like FODMAPs diet. She did GAPS for a year. She previously before that did, paleo or autoimmune based protocols. And when she saw me, initially, like around in November, she was actually currently on a low histamine diet. Okay. So going into that, so she was doing a low histamine diet for a few months and then was continuing that low histamine diet, even with the testing we ran. When you see the results, it's like, okay, those results are that abnormal still, even on a lower histamine diet, which really even drives home the genetic component a little bit more. So she had chronic fatigue issues, was told it was adrenal fatigue. Had a lot of anxiety pretty much on pretty much throughout the day, and it tended to ramp up at nighttime. So we're thinking, okay, could there be infectious components, other, things with GABA, there's a lot of different components that play into that. She had difficulty falling asleep, probably because of the anxiety, and then she would kind of sleep in 2 to 3 hour blocks. Basically she'd sleep for 2 hours, wake up, and then be up for a while. I was diagnosed by an endocrinologist with Hashimoto's, and then a functional doctor determined, the hemochromatosis aspect was there. So there's genetic components there that we're working on. That's kind of secondary to what we're talking about today. And she had chronic pain, almost like fiber-like pain. I think a chiropractor told her one time maybe that it was fibromyalgia. Migraines one time a week. Pretty much every week, something would trigger a migraine where it was basically like the rest of her day was shut down. She did have patches of eczema that she pretty much just had for, quite a while, like, 20 or 30 years. Seasonal allergies, pollen season, the spring, miserable. And here in Atlanta, we're getting into this now. So it's always kind of like a nightmare season for her when the pollen counts start going up. So she's seen a vast array of doctors, multiple alternative doctors as well. Some doctors that I know that do a really, really great job, but just maybe aren't, kind of as, invested or in tune with some of these missing pieces from a genetic standpoint, or doctors I have great relationships with. She currently was doing some, protocols for leaky gut and, the SIBO aspect. She was doing, she was trying to do some liver cleansing nutrients. And then previously she did some like IV nutrient, and then also did some heavy metal chelations. And she did not do well with that at all. And that's kind of secondary aspects. We're kind of on our hit list. Okay. And so what we did is we ran genetic aspects and
hey, John, sorry, can I interrupt? I'm so sorry, because I don't want to disturb your flow, but a couple of key points that came into my mind there was when you ran some of the tests and you got a test that was normal, but you kind of put it in context. And I think sometimes that happens a lot too, where I think it's worth noting in the course that we're teaching you to unravel some of the mysteries is don't conclude on something right away and dismiss it as a clue that could be a very important clue. Because John was saying that she was already on a low histamine diet but her markers came back slightly elevated. And sometimes that could be dismissed as, okay, well, it's not super important, but you got to put it in context where what have you been doing what have you been doing with your diet? What have you been doing with your life to know, have those changes impacted what we would expect to see on a blood test, so that it kind of like, if I had to plot a destination on a boat that went awry and it was going in a certain direction and it was going at a certain speed, I'd have to kind of predict where it was going and make some inferences. And John did that in this instance, and also in the instance when he asked about, I had some IV nutrition and that kind of didn't go well. So already a lot of bells are going off in certain areas as well for understanding the genetic component and how that relates to nutritional imbalances. And that's kind of what I think that, John, what I guess would you agree in terms of the interest of the course is to also make it so that the patients themselves can bring a whole new approach to how the genetic component plays into all of this. Would you agree? Would you agree on that?
Yeah, and teaching, people some of those clues based on how they responded to things previously, how they responded, to things, how they responded to things currently, either beneficial, adverse. It does give you clues, so you go back to kind of the IV nutrient, aspect. He was doing like IV Myers cocktail and just did not do well with it at all. That kind of gets into like glutathione pathways, like ammonia metabolism, sulfite buildup. There's different components in that, oxidation. Is there issues with iron and copper, which you already know because you got diagnosed with hemochromatosis? Is that something that just kind of blew her out of the water, like drinking from a fire hose? But to kind of backtrack a little bit, so Brenda, when I saw her, was currently on a low histamine diet. And, when we look at her labs here in a couple slides, her histamine levels are still completely through the roof. Okay.
Okay.
They're like screaming high, even on a low histamine diet, and
right,
so that kind of indicates that this genetic piece is even a bigger piece of it that we have to support.
Yeah, even bigger than it was. Yeah.
So what we're talking about gut histamine is this ABP1 gene. And basically what this ABP1 gene is, it makes an enzyme in the gut called DAO, or diamine oxidase. And diamine oxidase is responsible for breaking down the histamine in the foods that we eat. Okay. And so there's two main pathways with histamine. You've got the pathway on the left, or that goes through this H&MT gene, this H&MT gene right here, which is dependent on methylation. But what we're talking about today is this DAO gene, which is basically how histamine is broken down in the gut. Okay. And so in Brenda's case, this is where her genetic report looked. And I actually showed another patient's genetic report like last week that looked pretty much similar to that. And these to have twos in these are not very common. Maybe about 10 to 12% of the population has two mutations here where they're homozygous, meaning that the gene is going to make an enzyme that doesn't work very effectively. Okay. This 793 gene is the main one in the research, is the primary one we look at. And so she had two mutations with this. So from a genetic standpoint, we know that, okay, genetically, this is a piece of the puzzle, but just based on intuition and based on a previous test that showed increased histidine levels, indicated that, okay, let's run a test beforehand that looks at histamine levels and looks at diamine oxidase levels in the gut. So there's a lab called Dunwoody Labs that runs a leaky gut panel, or intestinal permeability panel, that looks at some things that deal with leaky gut. But within this, they also check histamine and they check DAO. Okay. And so this was her test that we actually had back the same time we had genetics. Okay. And so we knew that there's a genetic component, okay, based on the mutations that were there. And from a laboratory standpoint, this doesn't look very good. You can kind of see here, her zonulin levels are high, which basically indicates that she's got leaky gut, and she's been doing things for leaky gut for years. All right.
And the dial's not even on the dial, right? It's over.
Yeah,
over
exactly.
Here.
It's pretty much all these markers are pretty much like almost off, not even registering, so her levels are just completely skewed from this standpoint. We look at her diamine oxidase levels, her DAO levels, they are significantly low. Typically for me, when they get under 60, it's a concern. If somebody doesn't have mutations, or they have one or two and their levels are 60 or lower, I put them on DAO, and typically they notice a big difference with that. Her histamine levels, based on Dunwoody Lab range, 4.3, so significantly elevated. Basically, when these levels get above 1.2, 1.4, there's usually a problem with histamine, and usually the symptoms manifest that. And then her DAO to histamine ratio is kind of an advanced marker that if these levels aren't abnormal, but then the ratio is altered, it kind of gives insight that there could be some histamine issues. Now, realize this lab was done on her in November, or probably in November, beginning of December. Okay. And she was already on a low histamine diet for multiple months prior to doing this test. And she is still real strict about from a dietary standpoint. It's like, I tell patients, like, okay, you can kind of steer and maybe eat some high histamine foods on a rotational basis, as long as you take the enzymes. you know, she was like strict, like low and moderate histamine. That's all she consumed. And she was continuing to do that through the test. And so this is a reflection as well of saying, all right, this probably, if she was eating a high histamine diet, like if she was doing ketogenic or something that's high histamine, or she was doing kind of like a paleo diet with a lot of fermented foods, this probably would even be a whole lot worse. Okay. And so now we kind of really start connecting the dots saying, all right, with all these things you've done, with all the gut issues that are going on, it's like, no wonder why the gut can't heal. No wonder why there's like SIBO issues that, you know, are there, and reoccurring gut issues because the gut's leaky because she can't control the histamine burden in the gut due to these infections and due to food she's eating based on a genetic predisposition. So, like I said, she started support like really pretty much the end of the first week, because we went over this literally like on the 3rd of January. And so she started right away. And so I saw her once in February, and then we actually had a follow-up. Literally, it was like the end of not last week, the week before at a 10-week follow-up with her. And so basically at the mid follow-up, things were turning in the right direction. And we didn't really layer too many other things in. The focus was really just kind of hammering down histamine and loading up on DAO enzymes along with what she was doing from a low histamine diet. So at 10 weeks.
Hey John, sorry to interrupt. What was the dose of the DIA? How do they typically take that?
It can vary, and usually what I do is I have patients titrate up. So I have them start with, like, you know, in her case with these labs, I had her start with 2 of these enzymes, and basically it was like, all right, I want you to titrate up 1 every meal until you start noticing a change in something, whether it be energy, GI issues, sleep improves. I want you to titrate up until you notice something, okay? And basically her first thing she noticed we titrate things up was basically digestion changes, okay? And it actually, she titrated up where she was taking 4 or 5 of these diamine oxidase enzymes before each meal, and I was having her take 2 or 3 on an empty stomach before bedtime to be able to kind of give more DAO enzymes in the mix, even away from food, to kind of set things up for the next day. So we kind of loaded up. So I didn't put a lot of other supplements in the mix with her. Took a lot of stuff she was on away, because it's like, all right, I want to minimize maybe what people are taking. And we put a lot of focus in this to kind of see how big of a piece of the puzzle this is with her.
You already had the evidence, you knew the genetics, you saw the test results. That was no guessing.
Yeah, it really was. Now it's just becoming like, how much do we have to put the gas pedal down? And so, like I said, in the MTHFR crash course, we're going to teach people like, hey, what are some of the nutrients that are safe to maybe push to be able to titrate up like that, so you notice a symptomatic or a therapeutic based response to that, where, okay, we know that this is something that's relevant, because sometimes the dosage of things people are taking aren't nearly enough. And if there's genetic weakness, sometimes you got to push the gas pedal down a little bit. Okay. And so at the 10-week mark, she was having bowel movements pretty much every single day. And she really started noticing change like after 2 weeks of support. And that was kind of like that first week was like, all right, like every couple of days, let's increase the DAO enzymes until we notice a change in digestion. And so like when she got up to like that 4, it was like, oh, wow, things are changing digestion wise. She wasn't having a lot of the flatulence and kind of that constipated feeling. And she was actually having more frequent bowel movements. And at a 10-week mark, basically she was having bowel movements almost every single day, which she was thrilled about. Energy was improved. It's not 100%. She still has some crashes, midday, a couple times a week. Okay. And the thing is like I said, this is a huge player for her, but it doesn't fix everything. There's other players that are in the mix that we got to work on to optimize, the rest of these stories. But we can kind of see from a broad laundry of symptoms how histamine can affect so many symptoms in the body, because yes, things maybe aren't improved 100%, but just by controlling histamine, there's certain things that are trending in the right direction. So energy levels are improved, even though she's still having some crashes. Okay. Is that just due to digestion improvement? Possibly. Anxiety is much, much better. Now her anxiety episode, she's still getting, but it's all stress induced with like family, spouse components, work components, things of that nature, which kind of drive the stress. And there's some other genetic players that we're going to start working on here shortly from that standpoint. you know, the difficulty falling asleep improved and was kind of only there when the anxiety, or was only there now when the anxiety ramps up. You know, that's probably happening a couple times a week, you know, so there's nights of the week where she's actually able to fall right asleep, which is great. And now she's only waking up like maybe one or two times through the nighttime for restroom. And most of the time she's able to fall back asleep pretty easily. Okay. There are some nights where it doesn't happen. Okay. Cause like I said, this isn't like the magical supplement that fixes everything, you know, but we can see that things are different than they were in literally a 10-week window, which is phenomenal. Her pain levels were improved. Okay. Maybe about 50%. You know, she has, you know, previous lab works that shows, you know, positive Epstein-Barr and Coxsackie virus and herpes zoster virus. So that's probably also a contributing factor to some of the pain issues. So there's probably some inflammation and maybe some of their detox things that she's done previously that now maybe we can come back to and do a little bit different, knowing some of these genetic pieces of the puzzle. And I always tell patients that, like, hey, there might be some things you didn't tolerate, and now we know some additional factors genetically that we can come back to, and you're going to have a completely different response to that. And now something that should be effective for XYZ, you kind of fill in some of those missing components, and now that therapy or that protocol for XYZ is beneficial the second time around. Migraines, she's only had 2 basically since that, you know, starting the DAO enzymes at higher doses. Okay. Eczema, really not a whole lot of change, but it's probably too soon. Just all the gut damage that's there and the bacterial imbalances, that's probably something that's going to take time to heal. And then from an allergy standpoint, as of a week and a half ago when I saw her, really the pollen wasn't hitting her yet. The pollen levels are going to start ramping up. So that could be something we're kind of watching on. But I did give her some strategies on some things we can start loading up on. And if she does start having some symptomatic components through the pollen in terms of the typical, sinus issues and scratchy eyes that typically hit people with pollen, you know, we got some things that we can really ramp up to control that to see how much of a difference it makes. So really the component here was like, she was kind of like, her intuition was right in terms of saying, I'm doing a low histamine diet, but based on genetic factors, she needed DAO enzymes. Now here's the thing. She took DAO enzymes before. Okay, a functional medicine doctor put her on some DAO enzymes about 1.5 years ago and had her take 1 before a meal. Okay, but she wasn't doing a low histamine diet yet, but she was taking the DAO enzyme. So it was like they needed a combination of both. But in her case, 1 of those enzymes was not nearly enough to touch the amount of histamine burden in her body. Okay. The conversation I had with her 1.5 weeks was like, okay, once we get through this pollen season and we do some other things from a gut standpoint, we're going to try and start decreasing the amount of DAO enzymes. And that kind of put her in panic mode. Like, no, I'm taking 4, you know, I want to take them before bedtime. But as you get the histamine levels down and start getting under control, there should become less of a need for that higher dose diamine oxidase enzymes, unless maybe when she maybe consumes some higher histamine foods or maybe just with dinner. And so there's strategies where maybe she doesn't take, you know, 12 to, 14 of these things a day, because it's a lot and it's costly, but in the short term, it's something that's needed based on her genetic predisposition and what these labs reflected. And then we're seeing significant changes basically across the board in terms of some things are drastically improving and other symptom complexes are trending in the right direction. And now what we got to do is kind of work to that next layer of the onion. And we talk about genetics in terms of working through layers of the onion. And her first layer was she had to get histamine control in the gut under control for everything else to work properly in terms of absorption, inflammation components. And now that next story is like, all right, let's work on some things that do with the iron. All right, let's work on some things that do with maybe mitochondrial function. And then let's come back to things that kind of affect detoxification or support for like Epstein-Barr virus and some of those other viral loads that maybe can play into the fibromyalgia. And maybe she's going to have a completely different response this time around because there was this huge fire going on in terms of histamine in the gut that didn't allow a whole lot of things she was doing to be very effective prior to knowing this information.
Awesome. So a couple things there, John, in terms of number one, she started with, I'm compound heterozygous, right? And I've done a couple B vitamins and it's not really good. And a lot of people do horribly, and that gives us more clues as to what different things to look in as prioritization. And others don't really notice too much of a change. And again, doesn't make them really better or worse. And so that opened up the blueprint of what needs to be looked at, and then started to reverse engineer the game plan. But I would also say too, John, like sometimes you can have competing areas where there are susceptibilities in multiple areas. But then that's what it comes down to. What's a problem? What's not working, right? What's not doing a good job? And so in other instances, you may have a couple of things that aren't working, and there's becomes a little bit of a tricky issue of if this person's not generating any energy whatsoever, or they have some blockages in their lowering of their ammonia, or they have iron transport issues. Now you really have to also put in an area of prioritization that still involves histamine, but also relates back to what is it that you're dealing with. And that's what I think also you'll get out of the MTHFR crash course is, all right, well, here's all the things that we're giving you the rundown with. And then here's what you're dealing with. And then here's how we assess the priority related to what you're dealing with, so that we can give you the different labs to run when you have this and you want to investigate that area. Or if you didn't run the labs, here's some strategies that you can use, because we know you have high levels in this, that, or the other. But it still comes down to painting the roadmap with what John has said over and over again. John, as far as what we'll do is when we do it through Zoom, there's no ability to answer questions because they don't interface with Facebook that way. So when we're done, I've seen you've been going in there and answering questions. So John will go in there and I'll go in there too. I usually get there a little later because I'm actually posting it to other places. But John will get in there and answer those questions. Was there anything else you wanted to add to that, John, or do you want to give him a little primer for tomorrow?
Yeah, really not a whole lot to add onto this, and I just want people to understand, from the genetic standpoint, sometimes there's home runs like this, and I would consider this with Brenda, maybe not a home run, but a significant piece of that puzzle that was missing. And from a genetic standpoint, more often than not, there are some of these components that really help fine tune this up for a lot of people, and like I said, because it started with her with the MTHFR. And as we talked about previously, or last week, is like, you need methylation to clear histamine. So that's something that we have to work on with her. So the MTHFR component is important as well. So, this course we're putting together is really kind of designed to, walk people through, some of these usual suspects, some of these deal breakers that are some of these missing pieces that we see over and over and over again, that if they are there, they're going to have significant impacts in allowing things they're doing or things they're going to be that much more effective going forward. And so one thing that we talked about tomorrow of touching base on was metabolism and weight. Okay. Because there's genes that deal with why maybe somebody has difficulty losing weight. There's genes that deal with acetylation function, which we talked about, and how the body can take fats and proteins and use it for energy sources. If that's not working properly, your metabolism is going to slow down. There's genes that deal with how the body can carry carnitine into the cells. If they're genetically altered there, metabolism is going to slow down. So we're going to talk about some of the key components from a genetic perspective that we see with people that have weight loss resistance or the inability to lose weight. And, and this is something we'll cover tomorrow shortly, just on a couple pieces of it. But our MTHF crash course, we're going to go into more in depth and talk about what are some of the additional factors, and then what you can do about it to finally get your body burning those stored reserves and get your scale going in the right direction.
Yeah. And then, to me, that's, a lot of people might have some, is this course for me? I'm dealing with insomnia, or is this course for me? I'm dealing with anxiety. Is this course for me? I can't lose weight. Is this course for me? I do have histamine issues and gut issues. And the reality is that if you have any of those issues, the course is for you, because there's the genetic component to it, where you have to understand how we said it's not the end all be all, but it's certainly the roadmap to correlate what you are dealing with what genetic component and contributions those are. But to me, that wasn't awesome enough as it was, John, to me, the awesome thing is on Thursday, where you get to ask whatever questions you want to ask, so that we can support your specific unique case, and give you the actual instructions as to which areas to investigate and what strategies to use. And for $495, to me, John, I mean, that is such a great deal. And the fact that they get it, for forever, for lifetime, and then any updates that we do to it, because we know there's going to be genes that are coming through that are going to be new information. And hopefully by then, the update that you're getting, the information is just for interest, because you've already started to feel better and felt better by the time the update comes around. Oh, good, there's a whole new gene out there, but guess what? My stomach feels great and I have more energy, but hey, maybe I can take it another level and see what other enzymes out there that I could learn with. Isn't it amazing how it's always updating and always new pieces of information that way?
It's ever evolving. So this whole nutrigenomic aspect and how genetics plays in these chronic issues, it's a new science. It's a fast moving science. And, it's like every year there's new pieces of this puzzle. And, some of these things we're talking about now, we've kind of really understood and have kind of become available in the last couple of years, are having real significant game changers with people that deal with chronic health issues day in, day out.
Yeah. Awesome, John. So I guess we'll do it again tomorrow. And awesome information, man. Really great stuff. Thanks for putting all that together and creating this course. It's an awesome thing. So awesome. So we'll see you tomorrow, and have an awesome night. Awesome. A lot of awesomes in there.
A lot of awesome. That's awesome stuff, man. All right. Take care. I'll talk to you tomorrow, Joel.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.